The evening shift had barely begun, and already the floor was a maze of noise and clatter. Lisa moved through the tables with a practiced sort of invisibility, holding a tray high above her head. The tray was heavy, loaded down with plates of hot pasta and baskets of garlic bread that steamed in the warm air of the bistro. To the people sitting in the booths and chairs, she wasn't really a person with a name or a history. She was just a part of the machinery of the night, someone who brought water, took away empty plates, and hoped for a few dollars left on the table. She was 34 years old, though the tiredness around her eyes sometimes made her look older. It had been a long week. In fact, it had been a long decade. Lisa wiped her hands on her black apron as she paused near the kitchen pass. The uniform was uncomfortable, the polyester fabric sticking to her skin a little bit, but she had gotten used to it over the years. You get used to a lot of things when you are trying to survive. She looked out over the room. It was a Friday night, which meant the place was packed. The Velvet Note wasn't just a restaurant, it was a jazz lounge, known for its low lights and its atmosphere. People came here to feel fancy, to drink wine that cost too much and talk about things that seemed very important to them. Lisa watched them as she moved from table to table. At a table near the front window, a young couple was arguing in hushed whispers. The woman was twisting a napkin in her lap, looking upset, while the man checked his watch every 30 seconds. Further back, a large group of businessmen in suits was laughing loudly, slapping the table and talking over one another about stocks and numbers. None of them really looked at Lisa. When she set down their drinks, they didn't say thank you. They just kept talking, acting as if the glasses had magically appeared out of thin air. Lisa didn't take it personally. She had learned early on that if she took every rude customer personally, she would cry herself to sleep every single night. So, she built a wall. She put on a polite mask, the one with the painted-on smile, and she did her job. She cleared the dirty plates. She refilled the water glasses before they were empty. She hurried to the kitchen when a server yelled for an order pickup. It was hard work, physical work. Her feet throbbed inside her non-slip shoes, a constant ache that started in her heels and shot up her calves. She remembered a time, back when she was a little girl, when she didn't stand on her feet all day. She remembered sitting on a bench, her hands hovering over keys, creating music instead of just carrying dishes. That felt like a different lifetime now. Lisa had come to the city 10 years ago with a suitcase full of clothes and a head full of big dreams. She had studied music in school. Her teachers had told her she had a gift, something rare and special. She could play the piano with a feeling that made people stop and listen. She was going to be a performer. She was going to play in concert halls and make albums. But life has a funny way of twisting your path when you aren't looking. First came the bills. Rent in the city was expensive. Then came the car trouble. Then a medical issue that insurance didn't quite cover. The hours she needed to spend practicing to get good enough to audition for the big orchestras were slowly eaten away by the hours she had to spend working just to keep the lights on. She took a job as a hostess to make ends meet, thinking it would be temporary. Then she moved to serving tables because the tips were better. 1 year turned into 2, and 2 turned into 10. Somewhere along the way, the piano became just a memory. She didn't even own a keyboard anymore. She had sold it 5 years ago to pay for a new transmission. The only music she made now was humming quietly to herself while she folded laundry. "Table 4 is asking for the check," the bartender shouted over the noise of the kitchen, snapping Lisa back to reality. On it, Lisa called back. She checked her reflection in a small mirror near the station, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear. She took a deep breath, fixing her smile, and headed out into the dining room. As she walked across the floor, she passed the small stage area at the front of the restaurant. It was raised up about 2 feet from the ground, bathed in a soft, blue spotlight. Sitting there was a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, glossy and black, looking elegant against the dark curtain behind it. It was the centerpiece of the room, but right now, it was silent. Usually, there was live music here on Friday nights. A man named Paul played the piano. He was good, professional. He played soft jazz that people could ignore while they ate their steaks. But tonight, the stage was empty. Paul wasn't there. Lisa paused for a second, looking at the empty bench. It was rare to see the piano unattended. It looked lonely, like a waiting animal. She felt a strange little pull in her chest, a twitch in her fingers. It had been so long since she touched keys like that. She wondered if she even remembered how. She wondered if her hands were too rough now, too used to scrubbing tables and carrying trays to be gentle enough for music. She shook her head to clear the thought. It was a silly thought. She had tables to serve. She had rent to pay. Dreams didn't pay the electric bill. She moved on to table 4. It was the group of businessmen. They were loud and smelled of expensive cologne. Finally, one of them said, not looking at her as he handed over a credit card. "We're in a rush." "Of course, sir," Lisa said smoothly. "I'll be right back." She walked away, her heart beating a little faster than usual, a flush of annoyance rising in her cheeks. She was used to being treated like a servant, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. She processed the payment quickly and brought the receipt back. They signed it without looking at the total and left a few crumpled dollars on the table. It wasn't a great tip. She cleared the table, scraping the leftover food into the bin. The scraping sound mixed with the chatter of the room. Without the piano music, the restaurant sounded different. It sounded harsher, just the clatter of silverware and the loud voices of people demanding things. The silence of the stage was noticeable. Even the customers seemed a bit on edge, talking louder to fill the void. Steve, the manager, was walking around looking stressed. He was a decent guy, but he was always worried about the bottom line. He was looking at the empty stage, then at his watch. He caught Lisa's eye as she carried a load of dirty dishes back to the kitchen. "Hey, Lisa," he said, stopping her. "Did you hear that Paul had to leave?" Lisa shifted the weight of the tray. "No, sir." "Is everything okay?" "Family emergency," Steve said, rubbing his forehead. "His mom is in the hospital. He had to run. But we have 2 more hours of service. The room feels dead without music. People are complaining about the atmosphere." "That's too bad about Paul," Lisa said genuinely. She knew what it was like to worry about family. "Yeah, well, I need to figure out what to do," Steve sighed. He looked at her, really looked at her, for a second. "You play, right? I remember you mentioning it once when you first started." Lisa felt her face get hot. "Oh, a long time ago. Just for fun. I'm not a pro or anything." Steve looked desperate. The noise level in the room was getting bad. A large party had just walked in, and without the background music, the restaurant sounded like a cafeteria. He needed something, anything, to smooth out the edges of the night. "Look, I don't need a concert," Steve said. "Just some soft stuff. Background noise. Keep it low so people can talk." It would really help me out. Just for an hour until the rush dies down. Lisa looked back at the piano. It sat there under the blue light, inviting her. It was terrifying. She was exhausted. She was greasy from the kitchen. She was just a waitress. But then she looked at the busy, noisy room, and she thought about how much she missed the feeling of creating something beautiful instead of just serving things. I don't have any sheet music, Lisa stammered. It was a weak excuse, and she knew it. Just improvise, Steve said, waving his hand dismissively as he turned to greet the new party. Please, Lisa. You'd be saving me. Lisa stood there for a moment in the middle of the chaos. The kitchen timer beeped behind her. A waiter brushed past her carrying a tray of desserts. The noise swirled around her, but inside, she felt a sudden, quiet stillness. Her fingers twitched again at her side. She put the dirty dishes down on a side table. She wiped her sweaty palms on her apron one last time. She wasn't a concert pianist. She wasn't the girl she used to be 10 years ago, but she had the chance, just for 1 hour, to not be the invisible waitress. She had the chance to make the room sound better. She took a deep breath and turned away from the kitchen. She walked toward the stage, stepping out of the shadows and into the blue light. The walk to the small stage felt longer than the actual distance across the room. Usually, when Lisa walked through the bistro, she did it with her head down, scanning for empty glasses or signaling the kitchen that she needed more napkins. She moved like someone who was trying to take up as little space as possible. But tonight, every step felt heavy, like she was walking through deep water. She could feel eyes on her. It wasn't that everyone was staring, but enough people noticed the movement. A few heads turned. They saw the familiar figure in the black apron walking away from the tables, not toward them. It was a break in the routine of the restaurant, and people notice breaks in routine. She reached the edge of the stage. It was only about 2 feet off the ground, covered in a dark red carpet that had seen better days. There was a small set of steps on the side. Lisa stood at the bottom of them, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked over her shoulder at the room. The noise was still there. The clatter of silverware hitting plates, the low hum of conversations, the ice cubes rattling in glasses. It was the soundtrack of her life for the last 10 years. It was a messy, disorganized noise. She looked at the piano sitting in the spotlight. It looked so still. So peaceful. It was waiting for order. She placed her foot on the first step. Then the next. As she walked up onto the platform, the air seemed to change. It was warmer here, under the lights, but it also felt lonelier. She was leaving the safety of being invisible. If she dropped a plate on the floor, people might look for a second and then go back to eating. But if she played a wrong note, if she embarrassed herself up here, they would remember it. The fear gripped her throat, tight and dry. Lisa walked over to the bench. It was a long, black bench with a small leather cushion. She reached down to adjust it, moving it slightly closer to the keys. Her hands were shaking a little bit. She hoped the lighting was dim enough that the people in the back couldn't see the tremble in her fingers. She sat down. The leather creaked softly under her weight. The piano was large in front of her, a wall of black and white. She reached out and rested her fingers on the keys. They were cool to the touch, smooth and ivory. The feeling sent a jolt of electricity through her arm, straight to her heart. It was a sensation she had forgotten. Her hands were used to the rough texture of dishcloths, the heat of plates, and the sting of cleaning chemicals. This was different. This was clean. This was pure. She took a deep breath. She closed her eyes for just a moment and tried to silence the voice in her head that was telling her to run. The voice said she was a fake. It said she was just a tired server in a greasy apron who had no business sitting on a stage. But underneath that voice, there was a memory. She remembered being 12 years old, sitting in her grandmother's living room. She remembered how the music would take over, how she would forget to be shy. She pressed down on the pedal with her right foot. She felt the resistance under her shoe. From the floor, the room looked different. She was slightly higher than the customers now. She could see over the tops of the heads. She saw the young couple near the window, the woman still looking unhappy. She saw the group of businessmen, one of them laughing loudly with his mouth full of food. She saw an older man sitting alone in the corner, reading a book and slowly sipping his soup. Nobody was really paying attention to her yet. They thought she was just adjusting the microphone or checking if the piano was locked. They didn't expect music. They didn't expect her. Lisa looked down at her hands. They looked smaller resting on the keys. They were the same hands that had scrubbed floors and carried trays, but right now, they looked like they belonged to someone else. She flexed her fingers. The joints felt stiff. "I'll just play something soft," she whispered to herself. "Something quiet. Just fill the silence." She didn't have any sheet music. She didn't need it. The song she was thinking of was an old one, a classical piece she had learned 1,000 years ago. It was complicated, but it was beautiful. It was a song about sadness turning into hope. It fit the way she felt. She hovered her hands over the keys, poised to start. She hesitated one last time. If she started, she couldn't stop. She would have to commit. Then, a waiter dropped a tray of silverware in the kitchen area. The loud crash rang through the restaurant, followed by a collective groan and a few laughs from the diners. The noise level jumped up again, chaotic and loud. It was the perfect push. She wanted to drown out that noise. She wanted to replace the crash with something else. Lisa let her hands drop. The first note wasn't a shy, soft tap. It was strong. It was a deep, resonant C note that rang out clearly, cutting through the clatter of the restaurant like a knife. It hung in the air for a second, demanding attention. Then came the second note, and the third. It wasn't a jazz tune. It wasn't the background elevator music Steve was probably expecting. It was the opening phrase of a sonata. It sounded serious. It sounded important. The effect on the room was instant but strange. It wasn't like the movies where everyone instantly stops and turns around. Real life isn't like that. At first, people just kept talking. The voices didn't stop. But the music was there now, weaving through the conversations. It was a texture underneath the noise. Lisa's brain shifted. As soon as she played the fourth measure, the anxiety began to melt away. The worry about the rent, the ache in her feet, the fear of the customers, none of it existed on this bench. There was only the next note, and the next. Her left hand began to play the bass line, a steady, heartbeat rhythm. She played louder, finding the confidence she had misplaced years ago. She wasn't just pressing keys, she was pulling sound out of the instrument. The piano was responding to her. It was singing. She risked a glance at the nearest table. It was a group of 4 women sharing a dessert. One of them, a woman wearing a red scarf, had stopped talking mid-sentence. She was holding her spoon in the air, looking toward the stage with a confused expression. She heard the quality of the sound. It didn't sound like a waitress playing a joke. It sounded like a concert. The song began to climb. The notes got faster, running up the scale like a staircase. The melody was intricate, twisting and turning. Lisa's fingers remembered the patterns even though her mind was racing. She felt a rush of adrenaline. It was better than a coffee break. It was better than a big tip. It was the feeling of being good at something. The businessman at the loud table was still telling a story, waving his arms around. But his friends weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking over his shoulder, toward the stage. One of them nudged him, interrupting him. "SHH," the friend said. "Listen." The businessman paused, annoyed. He turned his head to see what was happening. He saw the woman in the apron, the one who had brought him his water 20 minutes ago. He saw her posture. She was sitting up straight, her shoulders back, her head tilted slightly to listen to the music she was creating. He frowned, then his eyes widened as he caught a complex run of notes. He lowered his arm. The conversation at that table died out completely. Lisa didn't see any of this clearly. Her vision had blurred slightly, the way it does when you are deeply focused on a task. But she could feel the room changing. The air felt lighter. The clatter of silverware seemed to be softening, as if people were trying to be quieter so they could hear. She poured her soul into the next phrase. She thought about the long hours she had worked. She thought about the dusty piano she had sold. She put all that longing into the music. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the bistro. It bounced off the brick walls and the low ceiling. It wrapped around the solitary man in the corner, who finally closed his book and looked up. The music wasn't just noise anymore. It was a story. And the entire room was starting to lean in to listen to it. Lisa played on, her fingers moving with a speed and grace that surprised even her. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a musician, and for the first time in a long time, the world was finally listening. The music didn't just fill the room, it seemed to take up all the empty space, pushing against the walls and the ceiling. As Lisa moved into the more complicated part of the song, the notes came faster. They weren't soft anymore. They were sharp and clear, like little crystals breaking in the air. Her right hand danced up the high keys while her left hand kept a steady, deep rhythm on the lower notes. It was a sound that demanded respect. The change in the room was not sudden, but it was undeniable. It started near the front and worked its way back, like a wave rolling onto a beach. The first table to really stop was the one with the 4 women sharing the dessert. The woman in the red scarf had completely forgotten about the cake on her fork. She was turned sideways in her chair, staring at the stage with her mouth slightly open. She saw the way Lisa's hands moved fast, then slow, then fast again. It wasn't the clumsy plinking of an amateur. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Slowly, the other tables began to quiet down too. It is strange how sound works. When one group stops talking, the next group can hear the music better, so they stop talking to listen. Within a minute, the loud roar of the restaurant had faded to a low hum. Then the hum faded away completely, until the only sound in the whole place was the piano. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a shocked silence. People were putting down their forks. They were turning their heads away from their dates and their business partners. They were looking for the source of this incredible sound. Many of them did a double take when they saw who was playing. They saw the black apron. They saw the sensible, non-slip shoes. They saw the name tag pinned to the chest. It was the woman who had poured their coffee an hour ago. It was the woman who had cleared their dirty napkins without a smile, just trying to get through the shift. They realized with a jolt that the invisible person they had been ignoring was actually a master of her craft. Lisa didn't notice any of this. Her eyes were closed now, squeezed shut as she concentrated on the music. She was no longer in the restaurant. She was back in her grandmother's living room, but she was better now. She was stronger. She was playing the way she had always dreamed of playing. The stiffness in her fingers was gone, melted away by the heat of the moment. She felt a surge of power. This was something she owned. Nobody could take this away from her. The song she was playing had a dark, heavy middle section. The bass notes grew loud, vibrating through the floorboards. The businessman in the suit, the one who had been checking his watch all night, felt the vibration in his feet. He looked up, annoyed at first, thinking it was just loud noise. But then he watched her hands. He saw the difficult stretch her fingers made to hit the far apart keys. He knew, just by looking, that this was difficult. He stopped tapping his pen on the table. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, completely captured. Even the kitchen staff, who usually stayed hidden behind the swinging doors, had sneaked out to peek. They stood in the shadows near the wall, wiping their hands on their towels, listening. They knew Lisa. They worked with her every day. They knew she was tired and broke. They had never seen this side of her. They looked at each other with wide eyes, smiles spreading across their faces. They felt a sense of pride, a feeling that one of their own was showing the world what she was made of. On the stage, Lisa's body swayed gently with the rhythm. She wasn't holding back. She played with a kind of aggression that she usually reserved for fighting her way through a crowded subway train. She attacked the keys, making the piano sing and cry all at the same time. She thought about the struggles of the last 10 years. She thought about the rejection letters she never sent, the auditions she never went to because she didn't have the money for the train ticket. She poured all that regret into the music, turning it into something beautiful. The melody climbed higher and higher. It was like a bird trying to fly out of a cage. The notes were intricate and fast, a blur of motion. A little girl, sitting at a table with her parents, pointed a finger at the stage. "Mommy, she is fast," the girl whispered loudly. "SHH," the mother whispered back, but she was smiling. She reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. They had been arguing about money just minutes before, the tension heavy between them. But now, they were just listening. The music had washed away their anger, replacing it with awe. It reminded them that there were things in this world more important than their bills. Lisa's fingers were starting to ache, but she didn't care. She could feel the energy of the room changing. It was like a physical warmth coming from the audience. They weren't just ignoring her anymore, they were with her. She could feel their attention like a spotlight. It gave her courage. She transitioned into the final part of the piece. This was the part that was soft and gentle, a stark contrast to the loud, heavy section that came before it. She lifted her hands high and brought them down softly, creating a rain of light, delicate notes. The room seemed to hold its breath. The clinking of ice in glasses had stopped completely. No one wanted to miss a single sound. A young man, maybe a college student, sat in the back with headphones around his neck. He had been looking at his phone, bored by the fancy atmosphere. But now, the phone was screened down on the table. He was staring at Lisa. He recognized the song. It was a difficult piece that he had heard on a playlist once, played by a famous professional. He couldn't believe his ears. He looked around the room, checking to see if anyone else was hearing what he was hearing. Everyone was. They were all spellbound. Lisa felt the sweat trickling down her back under the apron. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her ears, but her hands were steady. The music was guiding her now. She didn't have to think about which note came next. Her fingers knew the way. It was like riding a bike after years of walking. You never really forget. She looked out at the sea of faces for just a split second. What she saw shocked her. Nobody was eating. Nobody was drinking. Everyone was looking at her. The tired businessman, the unhappy couple, the gossiping friends, they were all focused on the stage. Their faces were different now. The stress and the impatience were gone. In their place was wonder. They were seeing her not as a server, but as an artist. It was a terrifying and wonderful feeling. She poured the last of her emotion into the bridge of the song, her hands stretching across the keys, playing chords that rang out deep and full. The sound filled the bistro, vibrating in the glasses on the tables. It was a sound of triumph. It was a sound that said, "I am here." The music began to slow down. The racing notes turned into long, sustained tones. She was guiding the audience to the end, taking them on a journey that was coming to a close. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet that you could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but even that seemed to fade away against the power of the piano. Lisa took a deep breath. This was it. The moment she had been working toward for 10 years, even though she didn't know she was working toward it. She wasn't just finishing a song. She was finishing a chapter of her life. Her fingers hovered over the keys for the final chord. She pressed them down firmly, holding her foot on the pedal to let the sound linger. She closed her eyes tight and let the last note hang in the air, pure and resonant. The last note seemed to hang in the air forever, vibrating against the walls and the ceiling. Lisa held her hands on the keys, pressing the pedal down with her foot, letting the sound fade away slowly until there was nothing left. For a few seconds after the sound stopped, the room was completely, perfectly silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a storm. Then, it broke. It didn't start as a roar. It started as a single clap from the man in the front row, the one who had been checking his watch all night. He hit his hands together once, loud and sharp. Then the woman in the red scarf joined in. Then the couple near the window. Within moments, the quiet shattered. The applause wasn't polite or gentle. It was loud and enthusiastic. People were banging their hands on the tables. They were whistling. They were standing up. Lisa opened her eyes, her heart still pounding. She blinked a few times, the bright spotlight making it hard to see clearly. As her vision adjusted, she saw them. The whole room was on its feet. The businessmen were clapping. The kitchen staff were cheering from the doorway. The little girl in the back was jumping up and down. A hot flush rushed to Lisa's cheeks. The adrenaline that had kept her going on the bench suddenly turned into embarrassment. She looked down at herself, realizing again where she was. She was wearing a stained black apron. She was just a waitress. She felt exposed, like she had been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to do. She quickly pulled her hands back from the keys and folded them in her lap, her head ducking low. She stood up from the bench, her legs feeling a little shaky, like jelly. She looked toward the back of the room, terrified of making eye contact with anyone. She just wanted to go back to the safety of the kitchen. She wanted to disappear. But as she turned to leave the stage, she heard someone call out, "Bravo!" Then another voice, That was incredible. Lisa froze. She looked out into the crowd again. This time, she really saw them. They weren't looking through her. They were looking at her. And they weren't looking at her like she was a servant. They were looking at her with respect. The businessman in the suit had taken off his glasses and was wiping his eyes. The angry couple near the window was holding hands, smiling. The atmosphere in the room had completely flipped. The tension, the rudeness, the impatience, it was all gone. It had been washed away by the music. Lisa felt a lump form in her throat. She had been serving these people food and drinks for months, treating them like kings and queens, and they had barely nodded at her. But now, because she had shared a piece of her soul, they were treating her like a star. It was a confusing and overwhelming feeling. It made her want to cry, but it also made her feel stronger than she ever had before. She gave a small, awkward nod to the room, a quick tilt of her head, and then hurried down the steps off the stage. As soon as her feet hit the carpeted floor of the dining room, the applause got even louder. People were reaching out as she walked past, trying to pat her on the back or touch her arm. It wasn't to get her attention for an order, it was to connect with her. "Amazing," one woman whispered as Lisa passed her table. "You have a real gift," said a man holding a glass of wine. Lisa didn't know what to say. She just whispered a quiet thank you and kept walking. She felt like she was floating, or maybe dreaming. The ground under her didn't feel real. She made her way through the maze of tables, heading for the sanctuary of the service station. When she finally reached the small counter near the kitchen, she leaned against it heavily, letting out a long breath she felt like she had been holding for 10 years. Steve, the manager, was standing there. He looked just as stunned as the customers. He was holding a stack of napkins, but he wasn't doing anything with them. He was just staring at her with his mouth open. "Lisa," he said, his voice quiet. "I had no idea. You never told me you could play like that." Lisa tried to smile, but her lips were trembling. "It's been a long time, Steve. I was rusty." "Rusty?" Steve laughed, a short, happy sound. "Lisa, that was the best thing we've ever had in this place. People are going to remember this night." He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. It was a rare moment of kindness from a boss who was usually too busy to notice anything but the bottom line. "You take a minute," he said softly. "Catch your breath. I'll cover your tables for a few minutes." Lisa nodded, grateful. She looked out at the room again. The applause had died down, but the energy was still high. The diners were talking to each other, but not about stocks or sports or complaining about the service. They were talking about the music. They were talking about the waitress who could play. She watched them for a moment. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Before, she had been invisible, a background character in their lives. Now, she was the main character. She was the one who had brought the magic. It made her realize something important. She had spent so long thinking that her dreams were dead and buried. She thought she was just a person who carried trays. But the music was still inside her. It hadn't gone anywhere. It was just waiting for her to let it out. She looked down at her hands. They were the same hands that had been holding dirty plates 10 minutes ago. But they felt different now. They felt capable. They felt like instruments. She rubbed her fingers together, still feeling the phantom vibration of the keys. Taking a deep breath, Lisa smoothed down her apron. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a musician who happened to be a waitress. There was a big difference between the two. She pushed herself off the counter. She had work to do. The shift wasn't over, and there were still tables that needed water and food. But as she walked back out onto the floor, her head was high. Her back was straight. She didn't look down at her feet. She walked with a confidence that hadn't been there when the night started. When she reached the table of businessmen, they didn't ignore her. They all stopped talking and looked at her with reverence. "Miss," the leader of the group said, his voice full of respect. That was something else." "Thank you." "You're welcome," Lisa said. And this time, her smile wasn't painted on. It was real. It reached all the way to her tired eyes. She poured their water, and as the liquid filled the glass, she realized that while she couldn't quit her job tonight, and while the rent still had to be paid, she had gotten something else tonight. She had gotten herself back. She walked to her next table, her steps lighter than they had been in years, ready to face the rest of the night, knowing she carried a song in her heart that no one could ever take away. The rest of the evening felt like a dream, the kind where you are floating slightly above the ground. Lisa went back to her tables, picking up the rhythm of serving coffee and clearing plates, but everything was different. The air in the room felt lighter, easier to breathe. The heavy pressure that usually sat on her shoulders, the weight of bills and loneliness, had lifted just enough for her to stand tall. When she walked past a table, people didn't just look through her. They nodded. They smiled, genuine smiles. It was as if a spotlight had been turned on, illuminating something inside her that they hadn't bothered to look for before. The young couple near the window was still holding hands. They weren't arguing anymore. They were talking softly, looking at each other with kindness. The angry businessman in the suit had relaxed. He wasn't checking his watch. He was just sitting, enjoying his wine, looking peaceful. Lisa went to the table where the four women were sitting. They were finishing their dessert. "That was truly beautiful," the woman in the red scarf said, looking up at Lisa. Her eyes were bright. "You have such a gift. Why do you hide it?" Lisa looked down at her notepad, suddenly shy again. "I guess life got in the way," she said softly. "I have to pay the bills, you know." The woman reached out and gently touched Lisa's arm. It wasn't a grab, like a customer demanding attention. It was a human touch, warm and supportive. "Don't let it get in the way forever," she said earnestly. "The world needs to hear that." Lisa felt a lump form in her throat again. She nodded, unable to speak. She walked away to the kitchen, blinking fast to keep the tears from spilling over. Inside the kitchen, the mood was electric. The cooks, usually stressed and shouting orders over the noise of the fans, were clapping their hands when she walked in. "All right, Mozart," the head chef yelled, flipping a burger with a grin. "When is your next show? I want front row seats." The whole line staff laughed, but it was friendly laughter. They looked at her differently now. She wasn't just the girl on the floor. She was one of them, but with a secret talent. They had respect for her. It felt good. It felt really good to be seen. Lisa helped run the food for the next hour, moving efficiently. Her feet still hurt, and her back was still tired, but the pain didn't bother her as much. It was background noise now, just like the restaurant noise used to be. Her mind was replaying the music she had played, her fingers remembering the feel of the keys. Then, near the end of the night, Steve called her over to the host stand. He was holding a small stack of cash in his hand. The dinner rush was over, and the restaurant was starting to empty out. The lights had been dimmed a little, making the room feel cozy. "Here," Steve said, handing her the money. "The customers, well, they heard me talking to the guy at table 4. They know you aren't getting paid to play. They started a collection." Lisa looked at the money. It was mostly 20s, much more than she made in tips on a regular Friday. "I can't take this," she stammered, pushing it back. "I was just helping out. It was only an hour." "Take it, Lisa," Steve said firmly, pushing it back into her hand. "You earned it. You saved the night. You really did something special for people. They want to pay you for it." She looked at the cash, her hands trembling. It wasn't a fortune. It wouldn't pay off her car or cover rent for a month. But it was enough. It was enough to buy a keyboard. A cheap, electric keyboard she could put in her small apartment. It was enough to start again. "Thank you," she whispered to Steve. "Thank you for letting me play." "Don't thank me," Steve said, shaking his head. "Thank you. And hey, if you ever want to play again, the stage is yours. Any night. We can make it a regular thing. People would come for that." Lisa walked out of the restaurant an hour later, after her shift was finally done. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the kitchen. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the street lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The city was loud, cars honking, sirens wailing in the distance, but the noise sounded like music to her now. She tightened her coat around her and started walking toward the bus stop. She felt the money in her pocket, heavy and reassuring. She thought about what the woman in the red scarf had said. "Don't let life get in the way forever." She realized she had been using life as an excuse to be afraid. She was afraid to try and fail. She was afraid that she wasn't good enough anymore. But tonight, she had proved herself wrong. She had sat down in front of a crowd of strangers and bared her soul, and they had loved it. They had loved her. The bus pulled up to the curb, hissing as the doors opened. Lisa climbed on and sat in her usual spot near the back window. As the bus drove through the city, passing the bright shops and dark alleys, she didn't look at her phone. She didn't close her eyes to rest. She looked out at the world. She saw an old piano sitting in the window of a dusty thrift store they passed. It looked beat up and out of tune, but Lisa smiled at it. She saw a potential in everything now. When she got to her small, one-bedroom apartment, she was tired. Her muscles ached, and her eyes were heavy. But instead of crashing onto the couch and turning on the TV to drown out her thoughts, she sat down at her small dining table. She turned on the lamp, the light casting a warm glow on the table. She took out a piece of paper and a pen. She had a lot of planning to do. She had bills to pay, yes. She had shifts to work tomorrow, but she also had a new goal. She was going to buy that keyboard. She was going to practice after work. She was going to find her music again. Lisa picked up the pen and started to write. She wasn't writing a grocery list. She was writing a schedule. A schedule for her life that included time for art. She looked around her quiet apartment. It was the same place she had lived in for years, filled with second-hand furniture and old memories. But it didn't feel small tonight. It felt full. It felt full of possibility. She closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. She could still hear the applause in her head, but louder than that, she could hear the music. She could hear the notes she played, clear and strong. She knew that tomorrow she would put on her apron again. She would serve coffee and clean tables. But now, she knew that wasn't all she was. She was a musician. And that was something nobody could ever take away from her. The waitress was still there, but the artist was awake. And finally, after 10 long years, she was home.